Hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining American Democracy Project for today's talk. And today's Times talk is by Dr. Tramel. He is a professor of philosophy. So give him a warm welcome.
So, should academics sign petitions? I'll start by just saying, I think sometimes you have. But what inspired me to do a Times talk today was an article in the New York Times back in August, in which a philosopher argued that philosophers should not sign petitions. And her arguments won't all be relevant to what I'm going to say, because I wanted to make it more general about academics. Her arguments are really stronger than we'll be able to talk about, but I don't want to talk only about philosophy. So to start with, I want to distinguish between a few kinds of petitions. There are intradisciplinary petitions, which are petitions that are only available to be signed by people in a discipline and about conduct in the discipline. I'll give you a couple of examples. And that's what she's really, Agnes Callard, the name of the philosopher who wrote the New York Times op-ed that I'm talking about. That's what she's mainly focused with, is intradisciplinary. But for example, also I don't know if you guys got handouts back there. There are some available. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I kind of regret going old school with handouts. I think a PowerPoint would have been better. I should have just asked what the setup would be. But anyway, that's what I did, handouts. So. And so these are defined here. Intradisciplinary petitions then are discipline members only regarding disciplinary conduct. I remember one in 2003, Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association. Many of us signed a petition to President George W. Bush saying that his reasons for invading Iraq, the ones that he was offering, did not measure up by the standards of just war theory. But it was controversial to have a petition like that in philosophy. There was a number of philosophers who thought it was inappropriate for us to do that at all. In the Eastern Division, a little over 1,200 members signed saying that the war was immoral. 200 and some signed saying, 200 and some dissented strongly, and about 500 didn't participate at all. So the majority participated on the side of saying it was immoral, but some didn't. And some thought that it was highly inappropriate for us to participate in that way, especially because of the nature of philosophy and free inquiry and that sort of thing. The idea that no position should be automatically out of bounds for philosophers, and that philosophers shouldn't pile on and bully people into holding certain views, that kind of thing. We'll say more about that. An example that the author uses, and she doesn't give a specific example, but apparently there's such a thing as deplatforming in academics. And deplatforming is a little bit like in the medical profession, kicking somebody out of the, I don't know, what do they call it? In the legal profession is disbarment, right? In the medical profession, the AMA censures people or kicks people out, takes away their license. Deplatforming is a little bit like that in academics, saying that, for example, a petition to deplatform a philosopher would be a petition to ban that philosopher from publications, from conference participation, that kind of thing. I don't know of any case where it's been done. I didn't research that very well. I could imagine it being done in certain cases where a person might hold a view that's so off the charts. I don't know, defending pedophilia, like that computer scientist who was in the news recently or something like that. I could imagine it possibly happening in a case like that. But the author of the New York Times op-ed thought that's inappropriate. We should never ever do that. I think it would also matter in a case like that, not just what the position was, but whether the person really met standards in defending a position, whatever the position is. The crazy position, we'll say. Then there's interdisciplinary petitions, and these are petitions that concern academics generally. They could be petitions, for example, defending the academic freedom of some person. I saw there was an instance in Nebraska a couple of years ago. There was a teaching assistant, and at the University of Nebraska. There was a teaching assistant and an English professor who went and challenged some Campus Watch people. I guess they had a booth set up somewhere. They went and challenged some Campus Watch people, and the graduate assistant really got kind of out of hand, I guess, giving the middle finger to them, calling them names and stuff like that. I'm not sure what the English professor did, but the institution censured the young graduate student assistant. She was fired, and they at least reprimanded the English professor who was with them. I don't know the whole story, but the idea was that there were a number of people who signed a petition, a number of academics from different disciplines, not just philosophers or English teachers or historians or whatever, that signed a petition defending the English teacher. And that would be just an example of an interdisciplinary petition. Others might be about things like, limits on academic freedom. If there were petitions circulating, say, among faculty concerning what limits of academic freedom ought to be, or what conditions for tenure ought to be, or any number of things like that, like maybe interdisciplinary. And then there's extra-disciplinary petitions. This is participation in ordinary politics, right? Like they're just petitions to Congress to do whatever, right? To launch impeachment proceedings, or to do something about the environment, or whatever it might be. Those are ordinary. The Times article wasn't really about those. It wasn't about whether academics should participate in those kinds of petitions, but I think it might be interesting to talk about those anyway. And I'm not really interested in our talk in just sticking to petitions. Political activity generally by academics interests me, not just petitions, but also, is it ever appropriate for academics to join marches or that kind of thing, right? Protests. Obviously, there's a history of academics doing that, but there's also always been questions about the appropriateness of it and whether it's an abuse of academics in some kind of fundamental way to do it. So the arguments that the philosopher gives in the op-ed piece, I'll just say a little bit. I put some of this on the handout, but she seems to have two main arguments that would apply to academics in general, and another argument that only would apply to philosophy. I won't talk about that one unless somebody makes me. But keep in mind, I'm not being completely fair to her, because she's only really talking about philosophy. So really, as far as how good a job she does defending what she's saying, we won't really be able to get to the bottom of that. But just interested in general academics. So her first objection is that results produced by petitions are anti-inquisitive. They're ad populum. They're piling on. Now, ad populum is when we appeal to numbers of people who believe something when it's inappropriate to do something. So being in the majority doesn't always make you right, and therefore it's not, in no academic discipline is anything decided by numbers, right? At least not in any simple way. It's decided by the quality of the research or the arguments or whatever is done. It depends on the discipline, really, what's appropriate. There's some things that are in common to all disciplines, and other things that are appropriate only to some disciplines. We'll say more about that. She says, though, a couple of quotes, one expert is a learning opportunity. Being confronted with an arsenal of experts is about as conducive to conversation as a firing squad. She says, persuasion by majority or authority is an unsound way to inquire. The employment of such a procedure constitutes a kind of philosophical malpractice. So, in a way, it's betraying academic principles to decide things this way, or to bully people through petitions. There's a piling on effect that this kind of thing can happen. Peer pressure, that sort of thing, right? And also, in petitions and intradisciplinary things, it's usually common for the names to be listed and lots of people to know who some of the names are. some of the names are rock stars in their professions, right? And she's worried about the influence of that, because we would never accept something in an academic discipline just because the person who said it was a rock star in the discipline, right? It always should be a matter of why they're a rock star, because of the quality of what their reasons are going to be. So she's worried about that. She's worried about things being anti-inquisitive. And her second worry is that results produced by academic participation in petitions promotes a bad epistemic climate. An epistemic climate is something I'm going to talk about, but basically this is it's more than just learning environment. It is something more like the culture and the standards that the culture imposes. I'll say more about this in a minute. And there's going to be stuff, I hope that will be discussable as we go on. And feel free, by the way, to stop me at any time with a question or a comment. But we'll get to some more discussion. I hope to be done and have plenty of time for that if people want to. She writes, as a philosopher, I want my influence to be philosophical, which is to say I want to bring people to believe only what they, by their own lights, can see to be justified. I don't want them to believe something because I am one of the many people who think it. So I don't want them to believe it because lots of other people do. I don't want them to believe it because I think so, and they should somehow defer to me. I want them to see, I want them to think so because the reasons support it, and they see that, the reasons support it. Now, against Collard's arguments, if we were just talking about academics, we could say a couple of things. First of all, there seems to sometimes be a necessity for petitions. That there are decisions that have to be made, and not making the decision is the same thing as deciding the wrong way. Sometimes if we don't say something about something, if we don't censure something, that's as good as saying it's okay to say that, something like that. So sometimes there seems to be a necessity for petitions, especially if there's not any other kind of democratic opportunity to say something about it, right? Like if there's not going to be some kind of voting mechanism or something like that, then with a petition we create one. It could be in a case of deplatforming, if there really would be a good enough justification to deplatform an academic. It might be sort of a matter of necessity not doing it. It could be the same as endorsing some terrible thing that the academic is saying or doing. I don't know, say a Holocaust denier in the history department or whatever, examples like that. Fairness. When these decisions do have to be made, if there's not any other kind of democratic decision procedure, then petitions seem like the fairest way to do it. And you have a petition, say this, signed by academics. Then, in that case, although the majority doesn't have to be right, it's fairer to go with the majority than to decide it in some other way. There's not a better way to decide it. It's like what Winston Churchill said about democracy being the worst form of government except all the others. And sometimes it's just like that, I think. And finally, democracy plus, I put. That is, expertise-informed democratic decisions are likely to be better than non-expertise-informed democratic decisions. How much to say whether a decision is expertise-informed, of course, depends a lot on what the issue is and what kind of expertise there is, right? Sometimes people's expertise is irrelevant. Like as a philosopher, my expertise is generally irrelevant to empirical questions like scientists try to answer, and their expertise is generally irrelevant to normative questions like I try to answer and so forth. And sometimes petitions are about issues that concern both, right? Both empirical and normative questions, like what we should do about, say, an environmental problem, which is going to require both scientific knowledge and knowledge about the ethical and political normative issues. And so there's no one kind of expertise that's decisive. settles any of the questions. I thought, in the case, going back to the case of the intra-disciplinary petition about the Iraq War, Eastern Division, the Eastern, and interestingly enough, and maybe this fits the pattern of American thinking, interestingly enough, the Eastern and Pacific divisions of the American Philosophical Association both voted fairly strongly and overwhelmingly to send petitions to President Bush. I don't think they probably got read. I'm sure they didn't really matter. But the Central Division did not, which might sort of fit general sort of patterns in the country and political views. But I kind of wondered when I thought about the petitions that all of the people who signed were philosophers and had probably some basic knowledge of ethical theories and things like that. They probably in some ways had opinions, this will sound elitist, but that were better informed than most people's concerning just war theory, understanding the reasons for various claims in just war theory and that sort of thing, understanding the challenges and the counter arguments and all that kind of thing. But most of them probably were not specialists in just war theory, but some of them probably were. And I would be kind of interested to know, like, so the majority of philosophers side, what did the majority of people who specialize in just war theory, what did they do? And I don't know the answer. No data like that was ever published concerning that. But so expertise, what kind, how much, how relevant, all those kinds of things. All of those kinds of things seem to matter. But still, it does seem like informed democratic decisions are to be preferred to uninformed democratic decisions. Now I want to say more about epistemic climate. So Collard was saying that this kind of political activity, signing petitions, makes for a bad epistemic climate. Now, that phrase is mine. She doesn't use epistemic climate phrase. I use that phrase. It's mine, and I got it from, I stole it from the military. When I was in the Army, former life, they would talk about the moral climate of a unit. So like a platoon or a division had a moral climate. And these could actually be very different. So look, I was in a unit that would definitely be described as having a bad moral climate, and I was in another unit that could definitely be described as having a pretty good one. And in the unit with the bad moral climate, there was frequently marijuana smoke rolling out from under the doors of barracks. There were prostitutes being smuggled in and out of the barracks. There was, if you wanted to find the first sergeant, you had to go to the club where he would be drinking whiskey and playing the slot machine and stuff like that. Bad moral climate, right? And it just has to do with how much bad behavior is tolerated. And that's what we mean by the moral climate, right? How much bad behavior is tolerated. And I was in other units that had good moral climates where none of that stuff would have flown at all, right? Where people would have, I may have been in that unit in the first place because I had been a high school dropout. But they didn't send us to the best places at that time, around 1983. But I was in other units where the moral climate was good, where none of those behaviors, like pot smoke coming out from somebody's door, that would mean whoever was in there was going to be in a lot of trouble in a unit with good moral climate. Prostitutes wouldn't have been able to be smuggled in and out of the barracks, at least not easily. And the first sergeant wouldn't be down drinking whiskey and playing slot machines in the middle of the day. In fact, that would have been undreamt of, right, in a unit with a good moral climate. So when we turn to epistemic climate, so I'm just taking this sort of by analogy and applying it to the pursuit of knowledge. Epistemic just means having to do with the pursuit of knowledge. Then we think of the climate in terms of what is tolerated in the pursuit of knowledge. Are we going to put up with lots of wishful thinking and other kinds of bad intellectual practice, or are we going to call those things out just the way a unit with a good moral climate would call out marijuana smoking or prostituting or whatever, right? Are we going to call those things out and not tolerate them? And part of having a good epistemic climate is going to be is going to be a freedom aspect. People are going to have to be allowed to say what they really think, and we don't want to put the kibosh on that. But we're going to be very intolerant then if they give only bad reasons for whatever it is that they are saying. If they can't support it in some kind of good way, that maybe discipline specific is going to vary. There are. When we think about evidence and reasoning, this is more objective than a lot of people think. What's a good reason? What's a bad reason? That's not all just like, do you like a painting or do you like a certain kind of food and in the eye of the beholder and so forth. It's not all like that. Part of it's logic, and logic is about as objective, well, it's not about as objective as what they do in mathematics. Whether arguments are valid, that's a completely objective question. We can actually say somebody's doing a bad job at that and prove it, right? It's not just a matter of personal taste whether logic is good or bad. And so in all academic disciplines, logic matters. We philosophers harp on it because we especially do that. We don't have laboratories and experiments and things like that. Logic is all we really have to guide us. So we can talk about that a lot. But then there are discipline-specific things like, for example, repeatability in most of the sciences. In most of the sciences, it's not enough to claim, I produce cold fusion in my laboratory or something like that. No one accepts the claim until it's repeatable. That is, until you can provide a recipe whereby they can, recipe is the wrong word here, obviously, but whereby you could provide the recipe so that they could do the experiment in their lab and see the same thing happen that you saw happen, and only then is it accepted, right? And so forth. So that's specific to many of the sciences, and also, you know, all the rules about doing good scientific studies, including in social sciences, things that double-blind studies, and medical science too, double-blind studies, and so forth. All these different principles that apply in different disciplines. And those things also they're not all subjective. So there's some objectivity there. In terms of the things that are objective, then we can talk about whether epistemic climates are good or bad, whether they promote good practices or bad practices in terms of the pursuit of knowledge, whether, you know, things that promote bigotry and wishful thinking and, you know, things like that, bad practices. That's pot smoke coming out from underneath the dinner doors. And the author's point is that really deciding things by numbers, majority opinion, or deciding things by authority, how big of a rock star are the signers of this petition, that those aren't really good practices, those aren't really objectively good practices, and so that's why she doesn't like them and why she is against petitions in academic inquiry. So I'd love to give you precise guidelines then going forward for what would constitute good academic political practice and what would constitute bad academic political practice. I can't do that, don't know how. But I thought I can throw out a few sort of general ideas and rules of thumb. So here goes that. Then I'm done, and then you'll have to ask questions or we'll have to finish. I sometimes talk too fast too, but feel free to interrupt. So, academic obligations regarding petitions and other public discourse. Relevant expertise implies an obligation to participate in public discourse, I think, actually. Like, it's not okay to, I think if you have relevant expertise, you need to share it if it becomes relevant to some issue of great public concern. So there's actually some obligation to participate in public discourse, maybe including signing petitions. It's a principle of professional ethics. I owe this to Dr. Faber. I don't think I see him, the dean he was a teacher here many years ago when I was a student. But he used to talk about something he called the ONO rule when he teach professional ethics classes. ONO as an acronym, O-N-O, and it stands for opportunity plus need equals obligation. And the idea was that professionals have greater duties to others because of their professions than other people do, like doctors, for instance, have greater obligations. Because of their ability, because of their opportunity, their special opportunity to help people in certain ways, they have greater obligations to do it. The opportunity plus need equals obligation. And as academics, we sometimes have opportunities to influence public decision-making in a positive way, to possibly improve the quality of it, to possibly improve the reasoning or the epistemic climate in which it's debated. Now, if you think about our general political discussions in America, the epistemic climate is horrible, even worse than my first unit in the Army. You look online at some kind of, at discussions that occur on Facebook or the comments sections below news articles, and it evolves into absolute savagery and no time at all with name calling and every kind of bigotry imaginable coming out. So anyway, if there's ever anything we can do to improve that, now I think jumping into those discussions and trying to act like an academic is usually not worthwhile. But if there's any other way to participate, possibly at some better level, then there could be an obligation to do it because there's certainly the need for it. If the worst kind of epistemic climate is going to determine what it is we're going to do, that's not good for us at all. So there's a need, and of course there's an opportunity if you have relevant expertise. Participation in public discourse as an academic implies an obligation to try to improve epistemic climate in every context. Anything you can do that way. We want, though, I think academics, at least I do, sometimes want to participate not as an academic, but I'm beginning to think we don't really have that option, right? So there was, for example, this KU professor back about 7, 8 years ago. You know what I'm thinking of? You might even know his name. It was on guns, yeah. It was, I think on his Facebook account, was it Facebook? Some of you know this story better than I do, but I think it was his Facebook account. He got angry about, I think it was right after Newtown. And he got angry and he said he wished there was only the children of people who were pro-guns who would get killed in these shootings, right? And he was doing something that's kind of a natural and common reaction for people who disagree with the public policy, which is to wish that only the people who were for that public policy would suffer the consequences. But wishing harm on children in the way that he did, the way he put it, and everything else was completely inappropriate. And you could say, well, he was on Facebook, he wasn't acting as an academic, and he probably didn't think he was acting as an academic. In fact, I'm not so sure he didn't need an invention that a colleague of mine once proposed, a colleague where I used to teach. She thought that we should have, the breathalyzer things they put on the cars of drunk drivers? They can't start the ignition until they blow. She thought we should have that for the send button, right, on the computer. And a lot of people would get in a lot less trouble maybe if this KU professor might have been, as the Scottish say, deep in his cups or something like that when he did this, I don't know. But he couldn't escape the fact that he was an academic. I mean, so that when people saw this, they didn't just say, I mean, he may have thought he had his academic hat off and was just being a regular guy. But people knew that he was a professor and therefore, right, took it that way, and therefore it caused a lot more trouble than it would if he had just been a regular guy, right? So we end up with an obligation, unfortunately, to be a lot more careful as academics, I think. By the way, I'm not saying that he should have had to resign or any of that. It's an interesting question. We could discuss it, but I'm not taking a position on that. I'm just thinking that he shouldn't have done it. Whatever should be the consequence, he shouldn't have done it. And it wouldn't have been so bad if he wasn't an academic. And so even if we want to take off our academic hats. So there's a kind of a duty not to rant or otherwise lose control over emotions in public discourse, I'm afraid, that probably goes with being an academic.
Would it have made any difference if he would have worded it, perhaps you should reflect how you would feel had your child been in the room? Could he have said that as an academic as opposed to saying that it should have only happened to children of gun owners?
Yeah, if I understood you, I think that would have been better.
The point he was trying to make was not the same, but he would not have made it in the way that he did.
Right. I'm not sure it would have made the same point he was trying to make completely, but it would have made most of it. Maybe the only part he should have shared was we should talk about everything we think. Probably. And especially not if we only, things like that people often only think for a minute, right? There's a lot of things we think for a second as a sort of knee-jerk reaction, and then upon reflection we don't think those things anymore. But unfortunately, with social media, we have opportunities to go down, for all history as thinking those things that maybe we only thought for just a minute and regretted the next minute, right? Which is a real danger that, there, but for the grace of God, go many of us.
Peter, can you share some of the policies, like the policies either that is here at this university or even where you used to teach with regards to all of this?
Well, I don't know what the policies are here.
Okay. Free reign.
Isn't that terrible? But they used to, where I was before, it was a little different, and they were very clear, and we basically couldn't say anything anywhere that we wouldn't mind having our name next to in the New York Times. Right? We were supposed to have, we had academic freedom, but it had to be something, you couldn't say it unless you were prepared to stand by it in complete public and so forth. Here I don't know. I'm sure that we're not supposed to, say things that reflect poorly on our professions and on the university and so forth, but I don't know the exact wording there. I don't know where all the lines are. I try to, in my own conduct, and I don't always, somebody will find something bad on me, but I try in my own conduct, because I, of course, have strong political views and things like that. I try in my own conduct, though, to not come anywhere close to where any of those lines would probably be. Right, so rather than study the policies carefully and try to do the, walk right up against the lines, just sort of try to stay away from wherever the lines might be. But there could be cases where I would need to look at the policies because I would want to say something and not be absolutely sure that I should.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So when has a petition ever changed anyone's mind?
I think they have. Certainly things like philosophers writing petitions to the president about the morality of something. I don't think there was ever any chance that had any, that was going to work. Yeah, but have petitions changed anyone's mind? Petitions can get people onto the ballot, and they have, they do that sometimes. Petitions can cause Congress people to rethink. I think, for example, that back when they were first voting to repeal Obamacare, that our Senator Moran was influenced by the amount of public outcry in his district against that, right? So that he wasn't with his party completely because his constituents didn't want to lose their health care.
Well, I ask that because as academics, if we have an obligation to help,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
we're out there doing things that do nothing, like
Yeah.
when I tell my children when they're underfoot, if you're not helping, you're not helping.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very often the case that what we are doing, what we're doing to try to help may not work. And certainly if we, go to what kinds of strategies would work. I'm sure that some things are such a waste of time that even if they're noble, that there's no reason they're not going to work, right? But petitions do sometimes work with various things. Interdisciplinary petitions can certainly work. I think, most of the faculty at Fort Hayes signed something regarding an academic freedom policy, the regents are gonna consider that, and they might, or if they sign petitions against the leadership of an institution, the regents are gonna consider their grievances, right? Whereas if it's just one of them saying, hey, might not happen. So yeah, but some of them are just not going to work. Then sometimes it's a matter of do we want to be on record for historical purposes? So we're not going to have any chance of influencing a certain policy, but maybe we want to be on record for historical purposes as having opposed it. Like I think the people in the APA, the American Philosophical Association, who signed the Iraq War petitions, were thinking that way. They didn't think, this is going to change President Bush's mind. He'll study just war theory and decide and realize, that he shouldn't do this. I don't think they thought that. I think they just wanted to be on record as a discipline opposing.
So is that self-serving in that instance?
Yeah, it may be self-serving, but maybe this could have good consequences down the road. Because of course, when we make future decisions, we often think about past mistakes, and so it can matter that way.
Sorry. So actually, building off of that, one of the things that I've been thinking about this discussion is a lot of the examples that you gave, such as faculty members defending another faculty member in petition form. Isn't that to a certain extent pack mentality? We are protecting the pack. Is there a moral imperative to protect the pack, or is there a moral imperative against protecting the pack?
I don't know, but I think sometimes that we have to defend our disciplines and their relevance. Maybe from a public that doesn't understand what the people of the discipline do or how it's relevant, and I'm in a discipline where we're always having to fight for our life, right? in terms of being funded and that sort of thing, right? So there's a kind of necessity to it sometimes. I think when science is being ignored, there could be a sort of a necessity for the scientists to get together and take action together sometimes. I think there could be an obligation to do it in certain kinds of cases. But in other kinds of cases, not, like when it's just a matter of sort of piling on an unpopular point of view to get it out of the conversation, to remove it from the conversation. I think of people, like, these are hard questions, like, is it valuable to philosophy that Angela Davis is, a member of the profession? That's always been a question, right? She is, and she's accepted in the profession publicly. She's much reviled. Who I'm talking about, Angela Davis. Some of you don't.
It's that younger group,
Yeah. It was a long time ago that she became notorious because she had been, I don't remember a member of what group was it, the Black Panthers?
Yes.
And the Black Panthers, and she had been part of a cell that killed a policeman in California. And she did some time in prison. When she got out, she became a philosophy professor. She teaches, I think it's UC Davis, is one of the UC, University of California, and so forth. And anyway, questions like, should she be in the profession? Philosophers have decided yes, she should, but the public is often, not on board with the discipline about that. So I don't know if you're thinking about those kind of cases, but in those kinds of cases, we generally want to avoid piling on. We want to say that Angela Davis should be a member of the discussion. I don't know if that helps with your question.
To a certain extent, but it also gets into these larger questions. Part of the argument that you presented is that as academics, we have a larger obligation to the general public as we are partially experts. However, a lot of the examples you have given are not necessarily based on expert response, like the Facebook AU incident.
Yeah.
You're looking at a faculty member who
Yeah.
lost control of their perspective, or temper, more accurately.
Temper, I think, yeah, maybe perspective, I don't know. But you're right, it's not a case, it might not be a case where the academic's expertise particularly matters, but it might be one, because it might be a matter of whether that should be included in academic freedom, whether academic freedom would extend far enough to cover remarks that insensitive or unpopular. And in that case, I don't know who other than academics ought to decide that. I don't know.
Don't we all have the moral responsibility to be accountable for our actions at every moment, though?
Yeah, I think so, probably.
Shouldn't that be our guiding principle and everything?
Well, yeah, sure, but then what is it we should do is still quite a debate. Somebody had a question.
Oh, I was just going to make a comment as I look around here and look at all the young faces. I was born before television, and Walter Cronkite was sacred. And what we have with social media and Facebook and all of the other things that youth is facing, maybe more than people my age, is what is the truth, what is real and what isn't, and the fake news. And I've never lived in a time when institutions were so criticized in terms of fake news to whatever. And so it makes the judgment process, it makes the where is your moral compass much more difficult to figure out going forward. And maybe there should be a breathalyzer for people who tweet at 2 a.m. in the morning.
I'm okay with all of that. But you're raising a very big problem, and when it comes to academics getting together, it might be sometimes to defend ourselves from the politicization of what we do, the way, we've seen the judiciary become politicized in a way that it didn't used to be politicized. It's partly because people no longer believe, that there aren't this sort of belief in a reliable source of objective information. There's rather sort of liberal news and conservative news, and liberal justices and conservative justices, and often academic decisions get criticized. Those academics are liberals, so we can ignore what it is they're saying or whatever.
Just a post comment. I'm sure that Abraham Lincoln had more serious problems than we have today, and often I remind myself of the differences that existed in the 1860s versus 2019. And somehow we got through that time. So I'm sure we'll get through this time too. But we are facing what the big crisis in my lifetime was capitalism versus communism. And we basically won that battle, and we basically showed that American capitalism was a wonderful thing. And yet, here comes 9/11 and the towers come down, and now we're dealing with something that most people didn't even remotely think we'd be dealing with. And how do you deal with all of the philosophical problems of bigotry and hatred and not lining up on sides when these are the things that are on the front page news?
Yeah, I don't think, well, I guess bigotry and hatred would be in a sense, a philosophical problem. But yeah, how to stop those is more of a social science question. What's wrong with them is a philosophical question, but how to stop them is more of like a political science or sociology question.
It's something that probably everybody sitting in here has an opinion about.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, everybody had, whether they had a strong opinion before 9/11, they have an opinion now. And 9/11 seemed to change the direction of the country, at least from my perception. It's really tremendous impact.
Maybe it did. We historians would, I guess, be who we could turn to especially compare that with the time of Lincoln or any other crisis. Yeah. No, I think that we do face a lot of problems like that. And to some extent, expertise can be helpful, at least in hopefully promoting a better epistemic climate for the debate instead of the screaming hysteria that tends to rule in general public discourse.
Where do you see information literacy fitting into that?
Well, I think that actually we're changing, for example, in our critical thinking classes, we're working more of that kind of thing into, trying to work more of that kind of thing into the critical thinking classes, just the classes that hopefully every student would take. And But that's still just the college educated, still a little bit elitist in that sense. But important, sure. And in terms of like, where do I look for objective information? If there's conservative media and liberal media, I just want to know the truth. And where do I go to find out who's being accurate, the conservative or the liberal media, or neither? Sometimes happens.
And for instance, I teach a course in the graduate school and we cover how to identify propaganda. And where when I was undergrad or in graduate school, that was nothing that was ever necessary to cover it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And that's one of the worries that the philosopher who wrote the article is that propaganda can be very influential in democracy. And that's a problem with deciding things by majorities.
Speaking of her points, I'm very curious. You said that she had 2 points that were relevant to everyone and one that was only relevant to philosophers. I'm not a philosopher, but I would still like to know what the third point was.
Yeah, I didn't prepare it exactly. I mean, I could read, but see if I can summarize it. I didn't think about trying, but because of the privacy of logic in our discipline, because deciding things by numbers is just logical malpractice that is particularly inappropriate in our discipline. It's like a betrayal of our discipline to sign petitions in particular, because it's an anti-philosophical method of decision. But logic matters in our discipline in a way. It matters to everybody, of course, but in our discipline, it's sort of the core and all we really have. You can settle anything. There are no experiments to settle the questions we're trying to answer, that kind of thing. No eclipse of 1919 is going to come along and solve it, right? Maybe we should follow Newton or Einstein. I don't know if that helps, but it's about logic and betraying logic. She mentions Socrates and sort of sees it as a sort of betrayal of what Socrates stood for. Socrates, of course, was very unpopular and put to death. It wouldn't, and refused ever to stop being philosophical, in the face of those dangers.
So with kind of all of that has been discussed and we've talked about, I guess I have a question for everyone here, but what do we think a good epistemological climate looks like? And how does that actually relate to being politically active?
I have a bit of an answer, but I don't want anyone to
Repeat your comment?
Yeah.
Sure.
Can you repeat the comment?
Yeah, sorry, I was asking what we believe as a general educated room should an epistemological climate look like? What's the ideal? And how does that relate to political activism?
I would just say this much, that although I haven't tried to describe the perfect epistemic climate, that if I go to a committee meeting at Fort Hayes and it's academics on the committee, that epistemic climate is a lot better than when I'll encounter if I go on Facebook and start arguing with my Facebook friends. And so, just like I couldn't tell you what the perfect army unit ought to look like, but I can tell you, that the first one I was in was much worse than any of the others I was ever in afterwards. And similar with, like that, I can't exactly describe perfection there. Maybe that would be a research problem that's a little out of my lane. But
One way to calculate it is to say, since this is part of the American Democracy Project, what are the preconditions for democracy? And one of the key preconditions is an educated citizenry. And if you don't have an educated citizenry, you put the democracy at risk. And I think we face some of that today.
education should be raising the epistemic climate, and to the extent that it's not, it's sort of failing.
If you're not always in search of knowledge, if you're not always trying to get to the truth, even if you never make it, And if you don't try to educate yourself as a citizen about governance and government and its role in society, you're never going to reach what you're supposed to be reaching in terms of democracy. This is the problem of trying to spread democracy in countries that don't have an educated citizen, that don't have the foundations of what that takes. It is hard work. It is incredibly hard work. And you can't just, it's kind of like marriage, it's hard work.
Plato thought it was impossible work.
Yeah, but
Would never work.
the striving for that is what makes democracy function. And when that threat to democracy happens, it's contingent on all of us, not just to be educated citizens, but try to work so that we expand the number of educated citizens that are out there. Because if you do that, then even if people don't agree, at least it's on basis of something that is trying to approach knowledge or truth, and is trying to get an understanding how another person views the world and why they feel it's world. And that, I think we have a significant problem in that. And universities and those of you who are students are going to be the key to whether that succeeds or fails.
If you're talking about the ideal climate, you're gonna start hopefully with a common goal. Like you said, if you're going in to a committee meeting here, there's probably a committee about this one thing that we're talking about.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
agree that one thing is important enough that we want to get to, so then you're debating, okay, we have different points of view, so we
Yeah.
can figure that out as we're going towards the same goal. So if you determine what your true goal is, that's probably
Yeah, no, that's right. But the committees too all have goals, and the epistemic climate, like the discussion in the committee is going to be better than what you're going to find just out on the street. So without giving any picture of what the ideal is, we can at least say we have examples of better and worse to look at and think about that way. I don't think that committee discussions are always super high quality, but they're always better than what you find.
sometimes the goal on the Facebook topics is just to argue, so it goes really well.
Yeah. Well, we like to argue with philosophy, but not in the same sense as none of that sort of one-upmanship way or whatever it is that people do. We're supposed to want to be refuted, like Socrates, who wanted to be refuted so that he would actually learn something. You don't learn it. If you prevail in the argument, you don't learn anything. If you are refuted, you learn something.
I wrote down, should we ever act in a way that's beneficial to bettering the epistemic climate with disregard to the well-being of the entirety of the organization?
I didn't hear all of that, Brad. Sorry.
It says, should we ever act in a way that's beneficial to bettering the epistemic climate with disregard to the well-being of the entirety of the organization?
Oh, should we ever do something to promote to make a better epistemic climate that would hurt our organization?
Yes.
Do you mean by our organization, like our discipline, or like like Fort Hayes, or?
I had petitions for the allocations of funding between departments.
Ah. There's an easy one. I'm still though having trouble seeing the case exactly. I mean, in general, I mean, what I have to do to answer your question is try to imagine a case where my duty to promote a good epistemic climate would be in conflict with my duty to champion my department. So like maybe it's in my department's interest to get a course on the gen ed goal. Is that what you're thinking, this kind of thing?
Well, even fewer teachers for more funding for better equipment.
Yeah, well, that kind of, like the gen ed thing could influence how many teachers we can have in the department, and how much money we're going to get to hire teachers and that sort of thing. That's why departments fight, for example, over things like whether their courses are going to be considered gen eds.
Right.
And so, anyway, there are probably other fights like that you're imagining. But I suppose if I really thought the reasons against my department getting that were better than the reasons for it, then I would be betraying the epistemic climate by defending my department's interest against the greater good. Yeah, it could happen. I'm not sure of any case where it actually has, but it could happen. I suppose if we were to say, for example, put a class on Immanuel Kant's philosophy on the gen ed program or something like that, something that specific, or a history class on the revolutions of 1848. I wanted to put that on the gen ed program, saying every student at Fort Hays ought to have this or something like that. That would be a pretty glaring example of somebody violating principles of good inquiry and so forth, and betraying academic excellence and epistemic climate for the sake of personal gain.